Some people live quietly. Some live safely. But some, like Steve Jobs, live to change the world and never take the easy road. He was not the richest man when he died. He wasn't the nicest or the calmest. But he was one of the most creative minds of our time. He didn't just make products. He made tools for the mind, machines that changed how people live, work, think, and connect. This is not just a story about technology. It's a story about passion, failure, vision, and one man who always dared to think different. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955, in San Francisco, California. His birth parents were young students and decided to give him up for adoption. A kind couple, Paul and Clara Jobs, took him in. They promised to love him and to send him to college. From the start, Steve felt different. He later said, "I always knew I was adopted, but I also felt chosen." Paul Jobs was a mechanic. He taught Steve how to build things, how to take apart radios and engines. But Steve wasn't interested in machines alone. He wanted meaning. He wanted beauty in everything, even in technology. As a child, Steve was smart but restless. He often got bored in class and played tricks on teachers. He had few friends, didn't follow rules, and questioned everything. At age 10, he discovered a passion: electronics. He also met a boy named Steve Wozniak who shared his love for computers and pranks. In high school, Steve grew his hair long, walked barefoot, and read books about philosophy, Buddhism, and art. He began to see the world in his own way, a mix of science and spirit, logic and emotion. Steve entered Reed College in Oregon, but dropped out after just one semester. He didn't want to waste his parents' money. Still, he stayed on campus, sleeping on the floor, returning bottles for food money, and taking only the classes that interested him, like calligraphy. He said later, "It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture." That calligraphy class would inspire the fonts used in the first Macintosh computers. After college, Steve traveled to India searching for spiritual truth. He shaved his head, wore simple robes, and experimented with fasting and meditation. He returned home thinner, quieter, and more focused, but with a fire burning inside. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak started Apple Computer in the garage of Jobs' parents. They had no money, no team, no plan, just a vision: to bring computers to regular people. Back then, computers were big, cold, and only for experts. Steve saw a future where computers were personal, friendly, fun, even beautiful. The first Apple computer, Apple I, was a simple board. But with the Apple II, things exploded. It became one of the best-selling computers in the world. Steve was just 23 and already a millionaire. But Steve didn't care about money. He cared about design, about creating something truly great. In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, the first computer with a mouse and graphical interface. The famous 1984 TV commercial showed Apple as a rebel fighting the gray world of IBM. It was bold, dramatic, and pure Steve Jobs. But inside Apple, things were not so beautiful. Steve was brilliant, but also intense, demanding, and difficult. He wanted perfection. He often shouted at employees. He changed his mind often and pushed people beyond their limits. The board of Apple grew tired of his behavior. In 1985, they removed Steve Jobs from his own company. At just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, the company he had created. For many, getting fired would be the end. But for Steve, it was a beginning. He started a new computer company called Next, aimed at universities and scientists. The machines were powerful, elegant, and expensive. Next didn't sell well, but the technology it created would become very important later. At the same time, Steve bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $10 million. That studio became Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled. But with Toy Story in 1995, Pixar released the first full-length 3D animated film. It was a massive success. Pixar became the gold standard for animation, releasing hit after hit. Finding Nemo, Monsters Incorporated, The Incredibles. Steve Jobs had built two companies, one in education, one in entertainment, after being kicked out of Apple. In 1996, Apple was failing. The company had lost its way. And so, in a dramatic twist, Apple bought Next, and Steve Jobs returned. Many people thought it was just symbolic. But Steve quickly took control. He simplified the product line, fired half the staff, took bold design risks. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac, colorful, modern, and fun. It was a hit. Then came the iPod, 2001, iTunes Store, MacBook, and finally, in 2007, the iPhone. Steve held it in one hand and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." He was right. The iPhone didn't just change phones, it changed the world. It changed how people communicate, work, shop, learn, live. Apple became the most valuable company on earth. In 2003, Steve Jobs was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He refused surgery at first, trying natural diets instead. Later, he accepted treatment, but the cancer had spread. For years, he worked while fighting the disease. He appeared thinner and weaker, but still spoke with passion. In 2005, at Stanford University, he gave a speech that became legendary. He said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at age 56. Steve Jobs didn't just leave behind Apple. He left behind a way of thinking. He taught the world that technology can be art. That simple is powerful. That focus is everything. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He was sometimes cruel, hard, and selfish. But he demanded greatness, from himself and from others. He once said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Steve Jobs' story is a reminder that even if you're different, even if you fail, even if people doubt you, you can still leave your mark. Listen again to learn his journey deeply. In the comments, which part of Steve Jobs' story inspired you the most? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories in simple English.